Good day, folks. Good evening, good morning, whatever time it is for you. We are now just 20 minutes away from the date marking the 1 year anniversary of President Trump's executive order addressing egregious actions of the government of South Africa, in which he suspended all foreign assistance to South Africa, which amounts to something in the order of $450 million, $500 million a year on average every year. Much of it for healthcare in the HIV arena, but not exclusively. That money went to third parties, not to the government of South Africa for the most part. But that stuff was canceled as a consequence of the actions of the government of South Africa in abrogating the Constitution and ignoring Section 25 and passing unconstitutional legislation to expropriate property from people with nil compensation. Something Dean McPherson, the Democratic Alliance, claims is actual compensation. I think he needs to go back to school. With a name like McPherson, you would think he'd understand English better than he does. Nil means nothing. Nix, niet, nine, nada, not the Bahnhof, means nothing. But apparently Dean McPherson, deep in bed with the ANC, thinks that means compensation. So we are on the cusp of the 1 year anniversary. What has happened in that year? Well, in that year, foreign assistance was ended. The government of South Africa acted abusively towards President Trump, and they stepped up their attacks. Initially, they said he just didn't know, he didn't understand. Then they called him stupid. Then they said the U.S. is aggressive, and their lackeys in the fake legacy media in South Africa continued to toot the horn of South Africa. When President Trump imposed tariffs unilaterally on 90 countries around the world, South Africa's media, South Africa's politicians pretended that he attacked only South Africa, when in fact the tariffs weren't an attack. It was an effort to balance the scales. You see, people talk about fair trade for decades and how people are being robbed and cheated by evil companies that underpay for coffee beans and for commodities from the developing world. But the reality is the United States has been the one being cheated. The United States has generously given African countries since 2000 access to our economy duty-free for 1,800 goods and services, plus under generalized system of preferences, another 5,000. So nearly 7,000 goods and services enter this country duty-free. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has duties, but Africans got an advantage as long as they adhered to governance standards, which they voluntarily agreed to participate in. So while that's happening, countries around the world are imposing 10% tariffs on all U.S. automobiles, while we impose just 2% of theirs. European Union, United States. South Africa imposed 70% tariff on our poultry, bans our pork, and puts quotas on other things, keeping us out of their marketplace with their protectionist measures. So Trump didn't attack South Africa by imposing tariffs. And other countries like Switzerland and many others, now India, have negotiated with the Trump administration to lower their tariffs. South Africa doesn't have a trade representative. It doesn't have an ambassador. It doesn't have a trade delegation. And it gaslights its population frequently by saying, we're waiting for the Americans to respond. They're not going to respond. You're not negotiating with them. It's about negotiation. It's called The Art of the Deal. You should invest a little bit of money and buy a copy of The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump, published in the 1980s, if I recall correctly, and it'll explain exactly what's going on here. So in that year, the South African government became increasingly more aggressive in attacking. They had an ambassador who called Trump leader of a global white supremacy movement, and America's systemically racist, and Americans racist, and he was persona non grata and sent out of the country. In the build up to the G20, the South African government lied about the refugee program. The politicians lied about what's going on. We saw Ronald Lamola go on CNN's Misinfo Nation, white genocide program, and he said Donald Trump is the leader of a global white supremacy. And he said that the program is racist because it's only for Afrikaners. You can only participate if you're white. Well, that was a lie from the outset, and it remains a lie. But that insult was heaped on Trump on the eve of the G20. Then throughout the G20, on multiple occasions, Ramaphosa mocked and laughed about the president. Ramaphosa and Dean McPherson made light of the Dim the Lights Natalie episode at the Oval Office, cackling like a hyena was Dean McPherson, thinking it's funny, the lies that were spread in the Oval Office. So in that year, however, with regard to the refugee program, which was included in that executive order, the government has been opaque. They haven't shared the process. They hired Church World Services, who has tremendous animosity towards the administration and towards the United States. Their goal is to flood America with refugees into this country, especially people who aren't from Europe. That seems to be the goal of Church World Services, and they attack the Trump administration at every turn. And frankly, I think it's mostly driven by the fact that they've lost the gravy train of money that they used to make. So they have been hired with RSA, their subsidiary, to process, pre-screen, and then process flights and schedule appointments for South African refugees. That's happened. The Amerikaners came along. They got involved. Some people tried to help out with pets. First, there was Pet Lift with Morgan Alsop. That's kind of gone dormant for a little while, it seems. And then Project X under Nicole Feldman. They claim to have shipped some pets to the States. They showed me pictures of the crates. I don't know the people or their pets. I asked to interview them. They have no interest in being interviewed. That's their prerogative, but it makes it difficult to verify that this stuff actually has happened without seeing South Africans in the United States with their pets and explaining to us how they got them across. So I'm not denying it's happened, but it's kind of hard to prove to my audience without someone willing to come on camera. Their prerogative. It also in that year, we had what I call the proof of concept, a pilot program. The government didn't tell us anything. And of course, I was correct, analyzing what was going on. And that led to the first 59ers coming over here on the 12th of May. They landed in the United States, including Thea von Straten, Charles Kleinhaus, the Hudsenbergs, the Langtons, and many others who came over here in that first batch. And then there's a long interregnum in which almost nobody came, but the pace has gone from May 12th to September 30th, a pace of just 2 refugees on average per day, because most days there weren't flights, to once the government shutdown ended in November, for those 13 days in November, it picked up to 37 refugees per day. And then in December, it was at 50 refugees per day, a rate that has held steady and increased from time to time since then, since the end of December. But the upshot is now after 1 year, which occurs in 16 minutes, you'll see this afterwards, but in 1 year, since the announcement of the program on the 7th of February, 2025, around 5 p.m., roughly that time, and I went live at 7 p.m., if I recall correctly, and started talking about this for 3 hours and 38 minutes before I went on to Gareth Cliff's program for about an hour. Then I came back to another broadcast. In that 1 year, we now have, if you go back to September, we only had 320, 340 South Africans here after 6 months. If you go now with the new fiscal year from October 1st, nobody came till mid-November. Until now, you now have just short of 2,000 refugees and more coming over all the time. They're flying out on multiple carriers and going to multiple destinations around the country. Some are having an incredible experience. Some are having a bad experience. It all has to do everything with the dedication and resources of your refugee case officer. So yeah, there we are. 1 year later, about 2,000. That number will grow significantly. I have no doubt whatsoever that the figure that was listed by the Trump administration of a cap for fiscal year 2026 of 7,500 with 7,000 reserved for South Africa, I have no doubt whatsoever we'll reach that 7,000, and probably within a few months, the way things are going. So that's the situation right now. We still see people lying and saying there's a slow uptake. No one's interested in this program. Only poor people, toothless oaks who can't be successful. We've disproven that. They're lies. We've talked about wealthy people come over. We've talked about poor people come over. We've talked about white people come over, Afrikaners, and English speakers. We've talked about single families, single persons, and families. We've talked and shown you coloreds who've come over. We've shown you Black South Africans who've come over under the program. And we are going to do an interview with an Indian here very soon who promised to interview with us. So we've dispelled all the lies. We also talked about families with someone who had a safe haven passport they made over here, adopted children who've come over here, divorcees, victims of domestic abuse have come over here as refugees. All of these things have happened, all of which you found right here on this channel, which is not a refugee channel, but it's the most honest, dedicated effort to keep you informed about the program, analyze this before anyone knows what's going on. That's what I've tried to do for the last year. And I would argue, unlike John Steenhuisen, I will take a victory lap because my victory lap is legitimate. His is just a fantasy. So here we are 1 year later. What will the next year entail? Well, I'm curious to see now. In the meantime, I'll continue to do meet and greets, travel around the country, places like Texas, Las Vegas, Utah, Florida, and elsewhere, maybe even New England sometime soon. All right, folks, that's going to be it. 1 year anniversary. Congratulations to anybody who has made it over here and wanted to come over here. Shame on the people who continue to lie about the program, and shame on the people who try to harm those who participate in the program. Your envy is sad, and you know there's a place for people like that in the afterlife, and it's not a good place. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time right here on the program. Cheers, everybody. Thank you for your patronage. Be sure to hit the like button and share this with friends. Thank you very much. Help us grow the channel.